Welcome to episode 5 of the Progression Health Podcast. I'm here with therapist, eating disorder therapist, Harriet Frew. She's going to introduce herself and tell us a little bit about her. So, Harriet, over to you.
Yeah, hi there, Ross. I'm Harriet Frew. I'm an eating disorder therapist based in the UK. And I've been working with people with eating disorders for a very long time. And initially sort of came to work in this field through my own experience of having bulimia, my late teens and early 20s. I recovered in my mid 20s, and I've been sort of, working in the field ever since. So and remain very sort of passionate about spreading positive recovery messages and giving hope, to this very day.
Brilliant. Yeah, that's great to hear that people can recover. You see it all the time, but sometimes I think we forget it or we get caught up in the challenges we're facing ourselves. So can you just tell us a little bit about your background in psychology, and what you currently do in psychology as it relates to nutrition and working with people with disordered eating?
Sure. So I actually work part-time in an adult eating disorder service in the National Health Service in the UK. And then I work also sort of part-time for myself as well. So yeah, my background is in counselling. I trained as a counsellor in my 20s. I also did train in nutrition. Actually, I've got a master's in nutrition. But really with eating disorders, it is much more psychological. Food is the presenting issue, but really it could be a number of other presenting issues. So though the food part is important, it's really more what's beneath the surface. So I've worked, so trained as a counsellor, and then I've kind of done, a lot more extra sort of training on the job, and worked. I've worked sort of on and off in eating disorders, National Health Services since about 2003. So I've gained a lot of experience just through kind of observing my peers, learning on the job, having access to great supervision and all of that really. So and it's an ongoing journey, because I guess there's more and more developments coming out in relation to eating disorders, and always learning.
Brilliant. Yeah, you kind of have to keep on top of the research, and wow, you really have a wealth of experience. So with the psychology of the nutrition, is someone's behavior, it's kind of like very far removed from what's actually going on? So is it like when you see someone show disordered eating or just kind of irregular eating patterns, is that more like the symptom of what they're thinking, as opposed to that's not the actual problem? Would that be fair to say?
Yeah, I think it all gets quite complicated, because I think if you're experiencing disordered eating in that moment, it very much feels like it is all about the food. But often, like I often say in eating disorders, it's not about food, it's about feelings. And I guess usually someone has probably decided to diet or maybe focus on changing their body because of there's been a stressor or something's happened in their life. And I guess in the kind of culture we live in, it can feel very seductive, really, to, like, if you want to feel better, your self-worth's not great. Well, if you kind of change your body, change what you eat, control your eating, you're going to feel good. And I guess in the short term, often that does give people those kind of benefits. They get kind of boosted self-esteem, they might get compliments from other people, but it can quite quickly then, I guess, get into a more disordered zone. So it's a tricky one, really, because I think when you're actually experiencing the eating disorder, you will be preoccupied with food, you'll be thinking about your body. And if someone said, is it about other things, you might be a bit confused. You might need to have a bit of support in exploring that. So it's kind of about both, really. But I guess the deeper stuff is there underneath as the kind of trigger, really, even if someone's not conscious of it.
Yeah, so kind of speaking of a trigger, so even if someone isn't diagnosed with an eating disorder, or if they are, would it be fair to say that they're never going to be truly kind of like free from disordered eating patterns, or it's something that you could always be triggered to kind of exhibit? Like if you had a really stressful time, or just because you have no stress in your life and you're eating regularly, we'll say whatever regularly is, then it doesn't mean that you're immune to having kind of irregular eating patterns.
I think you could always have a vulnerability, but I suppose I speak for my own experience. Like, I can safely say now, like, I have a very healthy relationship with food, and I guess stresses in my life haven't stopped in the last 15 years or whatever. And I safely say that I wouldn't go back to using bulimia as a coping strategy. I can really say that hand on heart. But I guess as well, it depends on, what kind of support and treatment that you've had, because I think some people kind of make a partial recovery, but they're still quite limited by a lot of food rules, and, they still perhaps can't eat socially or be really relaxed. Whereas I guess if you really make a full recovery, as well as being much more relaxed around your eating, you probably like really worked on your self-worth, you've worked at how you express your emotions, that whole kind of wider picture really, and I guess more stepped into a more healthy identity where you're not so defined by how you look or what you're eating, and more aligned with your values, your core values. And then I think that's when you can really step into a properly healthily recovered place, and you're much less likely then to relapse. Because I think if you've got good coping strategies for dealing with your emotions, if your identity is not all about how you look or what you're eating, you've got like a much more robust foundation then to deal with other stresses in life, rather than resorting back to the old coping strategy.
Yeah, so developing new coping strategies, that's essential. So it's kind of, I guess the question came from like my inexperience where I was kind of assuming that people would always relapse, but you can answer this. So it's like someone can be, almost perfectly like or 100% cured of disordered eating if they had a history of it. Is that possible?
Yeah, I think it is. It's absolutely possible. I mean, I think I suppose it's an individual thing. Like I think, say for someone maybe that developed an eating disorder at the age of 10 or something, and they had a lot of trauma and really difficult relationship with food from very young, it might be a bit harder to completely recover. And I'm not saying that's not possible, because I think every case is individual, and we have to really hold on to hope. And particularly, even if someone's 10 and they get early intervention, they're much, quite likely to be able to recover. But I suppose I'm particularly thinking perhaps, back in the day when people didn't really get the treatment they needed and they developed eating disorders very young. And then maybe now they're like in their 50s or 60s or something, and they never really had good treatment early. Then they are probably much more, much more higher risk, I guess, to be living with an eating disorder forever. But it really depends on the individual. And I think, again, I'm speaking from personal experience and other people that I have worked with, it is genuinely possible to make a completely full recovery. And I think the sort of stats show something like a third of people will absolutely fully recover. A third of people will partially recover, and some people will have to like live with the illness. So, but I think as well, that's probably based a bit as well on the old data. I think nowadays early intervention is coming more in for eating disorders. So I would hope that's going to change, as we move forward.
Brilliant. Yeah. So it's like a lot of things, the earlier you can treat it or the earlier you can diagnose it and treat it, the more chance you have of getting past it. So let's say somebody's listening and they know they have a kind of unhealthy relationship with food, or maybe they don't. Like, what are some things to look out for to be like, you might need to look into your relationship with food more. You might need to kind of think about it and reflect on it a bit more.
Yeah, well, I suppose if you're starting to be like really preoccupied with food a lot, if it's starting to interfere with your day, so maybe you're thinking like, oh, I don't want to go to that social event because I've got to go to the gym, or I'm worried about what I'm going to eat. If you start withdrawing from your friends, if you find that kind of, controlling your food, doing exercise, maybe other disordered eating patterns are kind of coming in and taking over from other things in your life that used to be more important. I think as well, if people are restricting their eating, they'll often feel like kind of cold, have poor concentration, have really low energy, not able to engage in things. And there can start to be a lot of anxiety just about kind of doing things that they would have been able to do very normally before without much worry. So I guess it's starting to notice those things really, if you're starting to realize that it's sort of encroaching on your life in an unhealthy way. So you're not able to do the things that you used to enjoy.
So it kind of sounds like someone's overly inhibited, kind of like I always struggle to try and define the term neurotic, but it sounds like neurotic kind of behavior. Is that right?
Yeah, no, I think definitely there could be a neurotic element to it, because I think like when you're getting up in the morning, you're not just kind of getting up and getting on with your day. You're thinking, oh, how much do I weigh? Or am I going to fit in all my steps? Or am I going to weigh my food? What am I going to eat? How am I going to avoid that situation? So there's kind of constant preoccupation about eating and not eating and how you're going to sort of make all that work. It's like a whole nother layer of stuff you've got to process every day.
Yeah, as opposed to like getting after your kind of responsibilities, your typical responsibilities, you have this extra layer of kind of, I've heard the term before. It's like you kind of take your health to the extreme, and you're kind of like, instead of pursuing health for the sake of being healthy, you're pursuing health for the goal of, just pursuing these particular tasks because you think those are what make you healthy, when in actual fact they're causing you more stress. Yeah, that's sounds like a really stressful position to be in, really, like getting up in the morning and thinking, if I don't get enough activity and I won't have a quote unquote successful day.
Yeah, and I think really, really stressful. And I think yeah, people get really caught because they almost feel like they might get up in the morning and just feel so weary at the thought of having to deal with all of this in a day, but at the same time just feel so anxious about not doing those things. They kind of can't win. Um, Quite a trap.
Yeah, a horrible situation to be in. So definitely some good points to look out for there. Then in terms of coping strategies, so what are some healthier coping strategies or way you can kind of foster those? Because I know just recently I've really learned about how important they are for uh, anyone in any walk of life, really.
Sure. But I think with eating disorders, like what's really helpful just to even start with is like before you even get onto the coping strategies, is like just trying to get a bit of an understanding of why you're using the eating disorder as a coping strategy. So like obviously that can be done in therapy, but even just sitting down and journaling really and starting to think about like what's happened, what stresses have you experienced, starting to almost like put the pieces of the jigsaw together to make sense for yourself. And then also as well, what's really important is motivation, because I guess people with eating disorders are often really ambivalent about change. And, they're sort of parted and they'll come to therapy and they'll think, part of me really wants to get well. Part of me doesn't want to give this up because it's helping me cope in some way. But once you start to realize that, like, what am I really gaining from this? What am I really losing from this? It starts to help shift your motivation, and you can work with the ambivalence because of once you've almost got your cards on the table and you realize, okay, it's helping me cope in these ways, it at least opens the door to thinking, actually, perhaps I don't really want to cope like this. There might be other ways of doing it. So, a lot of that work is quite sort of preliminary work is helpful before you even start therapy. And then I guess in terms of like helpful coping strategies, things like kind of starting to do regular eating, if you're underweight, beginning to like do some weight restoration, and that can be done with like a nutritionist or a dietitian. So you can do that in quite a kind of slow and managed way. And then there's I guess a whole plethora of kind of coping strategies. So, like helping you work on your emotions. Often people with eating disorders are completely disconnected from their emotions, disconnected from their body. They're kind of spinning on this hamster wheel, whether it be through restriction or compulsive eating. They're not really engaging with how they feel. So helping them start to like name their emotions, be in touch with their emotions, kind of develop all those skills and then deal with their emotions in healthier ways rather than trying to avoid them by restriction or eating. So and I guess in a lot of the things it's like just learning to like talk to people and share things and things in a way that can feel quite simple and obvious, but obviously when you're not using those strategies, or perhaps when you've been quite hurt or something in the past or bullied, can feel really, really scared about being vulnerable. So it can take some, courage and baby steps to start doing coping in different ways. Other things are like working on self-compassion. More and more research comes out to show how beneficial self-compassion is. Anyone with an eating disorder or mental health problems generally, usually really, really hard on themselves. And self-compassion is much more about like, treating yourself much more kindly, as you would a friend, and even beginning to realize that you deserve to treat yourself kindly, because people often have quite a lot of resistance to that. And then things as well, like working on body image. When you have an eating disorder, so much of your self-worth has become sort of almost disproportionately linked to what you're eating and how you look. And it's starting to sort of untangle that really, because of, I guess, most people on the deathbed, and when they're looking back, they're not going to think, oh yeah, I wish I was this many stone or kilograms, or or I wish I had a thigh gap, or I lost so much weight. They're going to be thinking, oh, my relationships, my hobbies, what I contributed to the world. And it's helping people as well start to like step more into a different identity as well, separate from the eating disorder. And then that's much more motivational for change as well, because when you're starting to think about the next meal or addressing your steps in the day, that can feel like what's it all for. But if you've got like a bigger vision and you know what you're going and you're much more in line with your values, then that's really much more motivational for change. So that's just a kind of taster. I mean, I guess there's quite a lot more that goes on in therapy, but that gives you a bit of a taster.
That's far more than a taste. That's an amazing overview. That's kind of inspirational in the sense that there's so many different things you can do to kind of overcome an ineffective coping strategy. So, like journaling, would you just speak a little bit about that? Because I like to journal a lot. I think it's really effective, but I find as though people either are like really, into their journaling. They're like, oh yeah, I do it regularly, or they're just like, it doesn't work for me. I don't do it at all. I'm not open to it. How would you kind of uh, sell? What would be your pitch for someone who doesn't journal? How would you pitch it to them?
Well, I guess I'd say first, like, get yourself like a really nice journal and a
Simple,
nice
yeah.
pen. So it's like, yeah, more motivational. So like it's a night, and then set a time to do it, I guess. So like start to set aside a small amount of time, and maybe don't set your goals too high. Think, okay, I'm just going to like write for 3 minutes or something. And I guess the different ways you can journal, like you can like do what you call like free association, where you literally just open the page and write whatever comes into your head. And I think for some people that can be really helpful. For some people, if they're in a really like negative, critical place, sometimes they might just pour out a load of like self-criticism on the page, and then that can kind of get you in a bit of a negative loop. So I guess things like kind of expressing gratitude and things like that, just trying to find like a couple of things every day you can be grateful for. Because I think I know myself in a way, when I'm in a place of feeling gratitude, it completely shifts your mood, and it's hard to, you're not going to engage with the negative thoughts as much, because it just really shifts your state into such a different place. So I guess as well, you can like, if you really struggle, you could get a journal that maybe has some prompts in it, like that are some open questions. I don't know, there's probably like a whole intricate journal kind of like, I don't know, world out there that I'm not even completely aware of. But I suppose just say as well, just persist with it really, and don't try to be perfect. I think people sometimes worry that I've got to write something down that's kind of perfect, or I've got to do a certain thing. But I think it's just like letting go of expectations really, and just sort of trusting that you have some wisdom within you, and actually you can access that when you start to write. Yeah, I mean, I don't know if you have anything to add, being a journaler yourself.
Yeah, I would say it's like, if you just think of the most simple quote is like, a problem shared is a problem halved. And you don't always have somebody around, especially because we're disconnected. We're communicating through video calls, so you don't have someone to talk to at the drop of a hat. But you can always, voice record something into your phone. Here's what I'm thinking, and think out loud. You can always grab a pen and paper, have it handy with you, or use the laptop and just literally get the idea that's in your head, like that you're ruminating on, get it out of your head, get it down onto the paper, see, the holes in it, see the good points, and iron out, something you're thinking about, especially if you're thinking about it for a couple of days. Because then if you're thinking about something for a couple of days, it definitely has meaning to you that you just haven't uncovered, I would say. That's my experience of an idea like that. And then you can really kind of pull out what is meaningful about it. And then maybe it might be something that you want to talk to somebody about, but you're kind of rehearsing it in advance. And then it kind of just, it just shares the problem that you have, really. It's not that complicated. But if you have, as you say, the expectations are set too high, then the barrier to entry is high, and you get into behavior change. You want to have low barriers to entry, and make it simple. Just get started. I would say get that fancy pen, get that fancy notepad, and you're away with it. Yeah.
Great advice.
So then you spoke about kind of like body dissatisfaction or body image issues. I think they're like a lot more common. Like even in myself, for example, I'm like, oh, I want to be healthy, I need to look a certain way. But then the side effect of that is you can do it excessively, or you can set unrealistic expectations. Will you just talk a little bit like about how prevalent that is in the general population, and then how it ties in with like disordered eating patterns?
Yeah, no, sure. So I think, yeah, body image is like a huge problem, isn't it? Just across the population. And I think particularly in our kind of Western world, it's so much linked as well to kind of self-esteem. Like, I think there's been some research that shows like at least a third of your self-esteem or something is related to your body image. So it, it does have a huge impact. And I guess, we do live in this kind of what I would call like kind of slightly diet culture world where certain bodies are really valued, aren't they? If you're female and you're smaller and you're thinner, you just generally kind of like admired, seen as having like better self-control. It almost seems to be morally superior almost. And I guess the same as well, for men as well, you've got to be perhaps like really muscular, but like have a like small waist and like look a certain way. And I think the tricky thing is as well, the reality is the world does give a lot of praise and validation and assume in a way that if you look really good, that you are kind of more virtuous in a way that you're a better person. And obviously that is really quite distorted. I think, I know myself, and I'm sure you found in your work that, often people that can look physically like very lean, very sort of defined, etc., often are really, really struggling with their eating, and there's huge costs to maintain that, really. So I think it's really tricky because I think we do live in this kind of world with all these pressures. So it takes quite a lot to be able to take a step back and think, actually, no, I want to really value my health. I want to like, genuinely value my health. I want to look after my body. I want to kind of allow my body maybe to be more its kind of natural weight rather than having to kind of sculpt it and do whatever. So I think it is really, really, really challenging. But I mean, I think what helps most with body image is just sort of stepping away from, again, like getting back to values and everything again, because I think, it's very easy day by day, isn't it? I think to kind of like, if you're getting praise and validation for looking a certain way, that can kind of feel quite addictive, and it can feel, like it can give you glimmers of self-worth, but it doesn't really kind of fix the problem, of making you feel kind of good enough. And I guess again, with your question, I think with eating disorders, obviously, like body image, negative body image goes to more of an extreme. So I guess most people in the population might relate to having negative body image at times, maybe like wanting to change parts of their body. But I guess if you develop an eating disorder, you kind of lost sight of things in a way, and you're probably prepared to suffer greater costs, whether that be like, purging, maybe taking laxatives, doing ridiculous amounts of exercise in the pursuit of what you perceive to be a better body image. But obviously that's an extremely destructive path.
Yeah, that's kind of the worst case scenario that hopefully not too many people experience. So then you're talking a lot about values. So like I'm reading a little bit about like self-determination theory, and I see that like values are a little bit of a part of that, and I'm learning more about them. But let's say someone has never really considered their own personal values, and they're like, whatever, 20, 30 years old. Like, why is it important to have our own personal values as opposed to like, oh, my best friend's telling me I look great because I lost a bit of weight, or someone at work is saying, oh, you're doing brilliant, you're working so hard. Why is it important to have our own values as opposed to letting other people, tell us what we should value?
Oh, well, I think great question. I mean, I think when we are truly aligned with our values, I think that's when we experience the most joy and fulfillment in life. Because I think there's so much noise in the world, isn't there, about what you feel you should do, whether that be whatever job that is, or how you should look, what your parents think you should do. Massive amounts of noise, all the social media. But I guess when you sort of come back in a way to thinking, actually, what is it that like actually really excites me and interests me? Like, how do I want to contribute to the world? What makes me like just really happy? Like, what do I enjoy doing where time just flies by and I'm just so in the flow of it? I mean, that is the kind of step towards true fulfillment and happiness. Because like you can change your body, I've heard it numerous times, change your body like to look a certain way, but kind of get there, and in a way you can just feel all the same things that you felt in your old body. Sometimes you just feel even worse, really, because quite a sort of empty feeling, realizing like, because even if the whole world is saying to you, wow, you've got amazing abs, I mean it doesn't really fill you up. Might give you a kind of a glimmer of self-esteem, but there's also then all the pressure to maintain it, isn't there? And feeling as well that, oh my goodness, people only really like me because of this conditional acceptance rather than really liking you for you. Um, so yeah, I hope that's answered the question. Waffled a bit there.
Yeah, no, it's great. Yeah, because let's say, for example, society is insecure about their health or their exercise habits or nutrition, and then people project onto you saying, "Oh, aren't you eating great? Or aren't you? They might do this, or aren't you very active?" But that's not coming from an internal source. So, like when that external gratification dries up, it's like, what are you left with? You're left with this like hollow feeling. You're left with your abs that you didn't really want, that you worked really hard for, but you never thought like, why am I getting this lean, for example, or why am I putting all this effort into what I'm doing? Which it makes me think about. I'm just doing some running recently, and I'm doing a lot more, and I kind of frightened myself. I was like, am I doing this running for external gratification? Am I looking to try and just get applause from other people? And then I was like, no, you're not. You actually enjoy having the variety of doing resistance training and running. So I guess the main point for someone listening would be that you want to reflect on what you're doing and
Yeah.
and think what it means to you. You're not going to the gym because your friend told you you should. It's like you actually genuinely want to do something.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's great, isn't it? It's a great example you gave there of just like pausing and just reflecting yourself. Because I guess we can all be vulnerable, can't we, at certain points to getting a bit led off down the external validation path. Because of as human beings, if someone praises you, it gives you a little kind of boost, doesn't it? And it can be easy to get a bit seduced down that path sometimes, and it could be taking you away from your values.
Yeah, 100%. And not to go kind of off the deep end, but like you can imagine a scenario where someone is like, had a childhood with a little bit of trauma, and like they get a little bit of praise, as an adult, this is kind of new to them. And they're like, oh, I'm doing the right thing now. This is brilliant. I've had a tough childhood, but I'm onto a winner here with whatever I'm doing. And the reality is it's like, no, that's just someone else's view of what you're doing, and your health and your nutrition and exercise habits. And you really need to reflect, and that's actually where journaling is useful, because you can
Yeah.
easily reflect with journaling, whereas sometimes it's hard to think things through in full.
Yeah, no, definitely. Like writing it down, I think is just really powerful, isn't it? I think it just really just helps you, yeah, make those connections much better.
Yeah. So then kind of connecting back to like the nutrition, how can someone improve their relationship with food? What are some of like typical recommendations or tips you have if someone is in doubt? They're like, oh, this food, I'm a bit uncomfortable when I eat it, or I eat a lot of this food, but I'm not really sure, should I eat that much,
Sure. Well, I think just a lot of the really kind of like straightforward stuff, like like regular eating, like having a bit of an eating plan, like that's going to improve your relationship with food. Having some routine, having some sort of blood sugar stability, and not about kind of like planning it all down to the detail or weighing it out or counting calories, but just I think a lot of people get into a really unhealthy relationship with food because they go like really long periods without eating, they get over hungry, and then they tend to like kind of like binge on food and then feel out of control, and then they restrict again. So it's not a very kind of sexy intervention particularly, but I think the good old regular eating and just having some sort of plan, making sure you've got foods in the house that you can put something together. It can just be quite simple. So I think that's kind of like a baseline thing. And then it's really trying to help people move away from like having like good foods, bad foods, becoming much more kind of food neutral. Because again, like if if you start to label some foods as bad, then when you eat them, you can often feel really guilty and anxious. And then paradoxically, then you can often go on and eat even more because then you're soothing yourself to try and feel better. So it's trying to get into that much more food neutral place, really. So that food hasn't got that kind of seductive special appeal, that like chocolate is just chocolate, really. It's not something that's a cheap thing or something that you can only have at the weekend, or because that just makes it so much more compelling. And then, human beings, we don't like rules. We value freedom. We like autonomy. So as soon as we feel controlled, we might be like the good boy or good girl for a bit, but then we tend to like really rebel against that. So it's just trying to get into that much more kind of neutral place, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I was just reminded of the analogy that I use sometimes. It's like, let's say, for example, cereal has been demonized, like, I don't know, Cocoa Pops or Cheerios or whatever, cornflakes. But it's like, let's just say, for example, you have, some of the Tour de France cyclists, England is very successful recently. So, like, they don't have that much time to eat. They need something, very tasty. They might have a bowl of cereal after training, and they're the most elite of the elite athletes. Does that make them a bad person, or is this food bad? And it's like, no, that actually is very nourishing for them in the moment. So it's very context dependent. And no, that black and white thinking is so, I do it myself sometimes. It's so toxic.
I think it's just so sort of prevalent, isn't it, in our culture that, people that even don't have eating disorders or disordered eating will still kind of say things like food's being good and bad, or like, I've been good today, or it's just so kind of normalized. So it's starting to like just take a step back really and notice some of those judgments and, yeah, trying to move away from that.
Yeah, thinking big picture. Something that I could pick up on what you're saying is flexibility as well. So just, not having too many rules. Why is it important? Like, imagine the scenario of somebody who has decided, okay, the pandemic's over. I'm looking to improve my health. It hasn't been as good as my usual kind of standards. Should they not kind of implement a lot of structure and a lot of rules to their health now that they're trying to make a change?
Sure. Well, I think like some structure and routine can be helpful. I think it, particularly you're trying to address your eating, but I guess that's kind of different from having like rigid, over control. Because I think the rigid over control as well, it tends to really sort of add fuel to the fire for that sort of abstinence violation effect. So, if someone feels like, right, I'm only allowed to eat, I don't know, one biscuit a day or something, and then they eat two, and then they just think, oh well, I might as well, throw in the towel and eat everything in sight now. So it's really important. Like it's just a balance, isn't it? Of like you need some kind of structure, but you also need it to be, yeah, again, flexible because of as a human being, we just don't like being stuck in a kind of prison of rules. We can do it for so long, we're eventually going to break free and just fight against it. And then it puts you in war with your body. And that's just such an unhelpful place to be.
Yeah. Recently, I had a client who she was doing keto in a previous plan for a year, and she's just like, I'm just fed up with it. I'm sick of it. I just want to have, a dessert sometimes, and I can't. And she felt restrained. So yeah, I like that distinction. It's like we don't want rules, we want a routine and a schedule, and then values as well. I guess you could tie it all in together. Um, that sounds like a really effective approach to bounce back from the pandemic. Um, so just speaking of the pandemic, then, like, kind of what have you noticed in terms of like trends or changes to people's kind of eating patterns, and then in your own client work as well? Do you have like more or less clients because of the pandemic?
I think, rates of eating disorders and just problems with mental health have risen dramatically with the pandemic. But I think as well, particularly with eating issues, I think there was quite a large proportion of the population that perhaps had slightly disordered eating, but was sort of like teetering on the edge of it actually being a full-blown eating disorder. But then when all the stress of the pandemic came, with all the changes, all that anxiety, people being stuck at home, all the different stresses. I guess everyone's stresses were slightly different, weren't they? But I think for many people, then that kind of tipped them into a full blown eating disorder. But they'd probably been skirting around the edges of it for a while, but had kind of almost probably kept it at bay by just like having distractions and, probably some healthy kind of coping strategies. But then that all kind of imploded a bit, I think, with the pandemic. So, yeah, definitely rates of disordered eating have been on the increase through the pandemic.
Yeah. So then I guess if someone is struggling with their health, their nutrition, their exercise, it's like it's kind of normal. But there is a lot, as you also already mentioned. There's a lot of things that people can do, and getting in contact with someone like you would be a great change that can make. Um, so how common is it roughly in terms of percentage, like disordered eating in the population? Do you know like the figures?
I
I'd
don't
say
know
they've
what
changed.
the, yeah, I think in terms of like referrals to services, I think it's literally doubled at least. And I'm not kind of absolutely sure of that off the top of my head, but and I know in the NHS service that I've worked in, I think like back last October time, we were almost like had triple the amount of referrals that we would normally be having. So it was a bit of an explosion, really. Particularly, I think after that, 'cause I think talk about the UK, we had the sort of first lockdown. It was over the summer, kind of a bit more of a honeymoon. I mean, and I'm not validating anyone's experience there. I'm not saying it's a honeymoon for everyone, but I think to start with, we didn't really know how long it was going to go on for and everything, and then we kind of went to winter and the lockdown, and then things really sort of took off a lot. Then seeing a lot more referrals. Yeah, so yeah, hasn't been great. But I think I know the service I work in now, referrals are back to a more normal level again at the moment, but I think there's still a lot of people out there struggling.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So they're like, oh, some places aren't actually open, like as in another client, he was meant to do a fight, and that fight's been cancelled because of COVID. So like he's obviously more
Yeah.
stressed because of that. Um, let's say someone is ready to like make a change, and they're ready to get kind of healthier again, but they're like, oh, I'm not as healthy as I was pre-pandemic. How can someone be more compassionate with themselves given that they've had this big challenge of the pandemic? Because I find compassion is talked about a lot, but like how to practically apply it, the understanding people have of it is kind of limited. Especially even myself, I definitely think I could do better at being more compassionate with myself and others.
Yeah, no, sure. I think it's a skill we could all improve on, really. But I guess it's just trying to see it, isn't it? Like in a way, say if someone has had a more problematic relationship with food over the pandemic, it's because it's a coping strategy. It's because there's been more anxiety, because maybe they've lost loved ones, because of there's maybe so much transition. So I guess it's trying to view it a bit more from a psychological perspective, so you can like offer yourself a bit more kindness. Because I think I just think even in the UK, the messages you get from the government are just like, oh yeah, just eat a bit less and move a bit more, and off you go. And then people just think, oh, well, I'm really, I'm really bad because I can't do that. What's wrong with me? And then kind of get the stick out and become really, uncompassionate and become really, really critical. So I guess it's trying to view it a bit from the psychological perspective, really, and thinking about, if they'd heard a friend going through all these things that they've probably been through, they would probably again be so much more compassionate towards a friend than they would be to themselves. So I think that's often a way in as well to think, what would I say to my like really close friend about this? And realizing in a way, actually, I've got permission to do that for myself too. And I think one thing I say to people as well is I think some people think, oh, well, if I'm self-compassionate, then that means I'm lazy and I'm not going to be motivated. And I would say to people as well, like imagine if you're like teaching a child to ride a bike, if they fall off, you're like, come on, get back on again, you can do it. You're really encouraging and warm and supportive. And you still want them to get that end goal of riding the bike, but you're doing it with like so much warmth and encouragement. And I sort of think as well, that's a lot about what self-compassion is. You're like your kind of cheerleader and encourager. So, like if someone falls off the bike, you're not being super critical because they never get back on again, would they? And I think that's often the way we are towards ourselves. So self-compassion isn't about just kind of like giving up on your goals and kind of like sitting on the sofa and never doing anything. You can still like be quite a high achiever, still want to do lots of great things, but it's much more just about how you approach it, with your thoughts, behaviors, how you talk to yourself, all of that.
Yeah, I think is the definition of compassion. It's like being with suffering. Is that?
I don't know what the absolute, yeah, but pretty much, yeah.
Yeah, I feel as though I've heard it before in like meditation circles that compassion is basically just being with the suffering you're feeling. So it's like, that the quote you hear, eat less, move more. Well, move more. What about the person who has an injury? Like, what do they do? Or what about the person with the eating disorder? How do they eat less? They have an unhealthy relationship, so they can't. They're kind of suffering as it is. Their suffering needs to be met with compassion. And the suggestion of how would you speak to a friend it's funny. It's like it takes time for the penny to drop. I feel like I heard that probably hundreds of times, and it's kind of like slowly but surely I'm trying to do it myself more and other people. It's like you really have to be serious about the advice you hear and take it in and apply it. You can't just be like, oh, that sounds like a good idea. You have to kind of almost move yourself from the kind of, would it be like the contemplation stage to like the action stage of behavior change. You really have to like be serious about, I guess, how you can improve your habits and
Yeah.
take an action to improve those habits that maybe you want to get rid of or implement more in your life.
Yeah, no, it's so true, I think, isn't it? It's almost like if you think about the number of thoughts you have a day, like it's 60,000 plus or something, and so many of them are repetitive. So it's going to take, you can't just like think, okay, I'm going to like do about 10 minutes self-compassion once a week. It's just going to have such a small impact, isn't it? It's almost got to become much more part of just your daily life. And of course, you've got to build up to that slowly, haven't you, with baby steps? But it will start to have quite a profound impact the more you become self-aware and the more you're able to step in and talk to yourself in kinder ways. But yeah, it takes time, doesn't it? I mean, I always think as well, it's like building your emotional muscles. Like if you're going to the gym or something, it takes a while, doesn't it, to get fit and so change your body if that's what you want to do. And it's the same with your mind and your mental health. It takes time and practice and repetition of habits.
Absolutely, yeah, repetition. So it's like you have to form a different routine and a different schedule that aligns more, based on your values, aligns more with, what you envisage yourself being. So it's like you have an eating disorder, you're trying to form a healthier coping strategy. So your schedule, maybe your daily, I'm not sure, what you'd recommend, but like maybe your daily or weekly schedule has to have some element of a practice that is aligned with the person or the habit you're trying to form. So it could be just that compassion exercise of on a daily basis, you just stop and say, am I talking to myself like I would talk to like my best friend or a loved one? That might be something you could implement straight away.
Yeah, no, really true. And I think as well, sometimes I'm sure some people like listening or watching this, they might just feel so far from that place. But as well, I think as well, if you're really stuck in a dark hole, that's where things like therapy can just be so helpful. Or even just starting to talk a bit more to a close and trusted friend who's like accepting and who can listen and who's really supportive. Because sometimes when we're in our own heads, it can just feel so hard to kind of like shift gears almost.
Yeah, 100%. I don't know where I heard this analogy, but it was like if you were to get kind of stabbed, for example, I know that's a very extreme example, but if you were to get stabbed, right, you wouldn't say, "Oh, sure, I'll be grand. I'll go to work in the morning. I'll patch it up myself. I won't tell my partner. I won't tell the friends or coworkers. I got this. This wound in me, it'll be fine." But mental health is kind of like that. We say, for example, I know like I've been like depressed over the pandemic. I'm sure a lot of people have, and it's like it's so bizarre, but it's like the last thing you want to do is open up to someone else. It feels so difficult, but that's the thing. you
Yeah.
need you need to share whatever struggle you have. So like I think eating disorders are a little bit different because there's like a lot of shame and guilt that can go with it, because it's like, oh, we need food, I should be able to control my food, I've had it my whole life. But people, what, any idea why is there more, do you think there's more shame and guilt attached to food than there is other things, other challenges?
Yeah, no, I mean, possibly. I mean, I think it is, and but I think particularly as well, if you get into like binging, purging, that kind of thing. I mean, there's so much shame, isn't there? I think, and yeah, people just feel as well they should be able to kind of have more willpower and self-control and all those things. So, and I think it's really difficult because I think often family and friends don't always understand. And I mean, hopefully for some people, they have got supportive people around them, but I think sometimes people with good intentions can say quite unhelpful things, just because they don't understand eating disorders, and then that can make someone feel even more ashamed and then withdraw further. So I guess it's quite important that when someone opens up, that they perhaps do really think a little bit about who they're going to talk to, so they can feel safe to really share.
Yeah, for sure. And something I've learned as well is like just speaking with clients more and being more aware that it's like you might think you know what someone's going through, but like I realized I actually have no idea at all. And I'll never understand what they're going through because that's their like individual experience. I might be able to just, I think the best thing I kind of hope for is that I'll be a better listener for whatever kind of challenges they have, so that then they just have a space to basically open up. Because, some people have really challenging experiences. The pandemic has been a real test. And then the side effects when they don't get to open up are potential eating disorders. So it's like, sometimes the best thing you can do is just listen, just kind of shut up and just listen and hear someone out.
Yeah, no, I so agree. And I mean, I think we all relate to that, don't we? Like when you have a problem, actually, you don't really want someone to give you loads of advice or something. You just want someone just to listen and just kind of be empathetic and just be there for you. That's the most helpful thing, isn't it? We don't really want it to be fixed, and often it can't be fixed just like that. But just being heard is really, really valuable.
Yeah, absolutely. It kind of goes back to how we don't want to be controlled. So the last thing we want is to go to somebody and they say, okay, you're going to do this and you're going to be here. And then at this time, you're going to do that. It's like, no, I'm my own individual. I'm an adult. I
Yeah.
value my autonomy. I want to make my own choices in life. And then you'll feel better about it when you make your own choices as well. So yeah, that's a really good advice, actually, to be careful of who you speak to when you do open up, because um, it's actually far worse when you're ready to open up to somebody, particularly about like an eating disorder where there might be more shame and guilt, and then they throw it back in your face. That is like probably the worst
Mm.
thing we could do to another person is, here's your vulnerability, and I'm going to make you feel bad about you being vulnerable, when in actual fact, it's like, probably the most, like Brene Brown would say, it's probably like, it takes a lot of courage and bravery to be vulnerable with another person, because they essentially know your deepest kind of, we'll say, fears or needs and stuff.
Mm. Yeah, no, so true. But I guess I say to anyone as well, like to if you do have a bad experience, don't be put off. I suppose it's because I think it's still just so important to reach out, and there are a lot of people out there in the world who are really compassionate and accepting and encouraging, and yeah, you just got to find them, because there are a lot of people that will be really pleased to support and listen.
Yeah, that's why we offer our service, that we try and we try and help people, and we'd like to think that we'll give uh, uh, good kind of listening skills to the situation they're in. But there is lots of people out there, as you said already. There's lots of ways to kind of to cope. So just getting close to the end, we'll kind of wrap up with like three quick fire questions. So um, what are some kind of like poor habits that you notice people typically have around eating that are like relatively easy to improve?
Well, so outside what we've talked about, so I guess the first thing I wanted to say was kind of like the regular eating, really. Um, yeah, I mean, I'd almost say like introducing old forbidden foods in quite a structured way. That can be quite a good tip. Because I think, everyone's always harping on about don't have good and bad foods, introduce foods back in. But I think if you've had an eating disorder or disordered eating, you need to do that in really quite a structured way, or you'll feel really overwhelmed. So what you might do is like say, write down 5 foods you want to introduce, rank them, introduce the easiest one first. And then other things you like, I always say to people as well, like if you've had a problem with eating, sit down at a table, set a place, make it nice, try and eat without distractions. That's all really helpful as well, because a lot of eating when you've had disordered eating is quite dissociated at the cupboard door, things like that. And just finding foods that you like again as well. I think people in their relationship with food often, convince themselves they like certain things, but actually that's all about kind of diet culture and what they feel they should be eating. So getting back in touch with what you genuinely like, thinking about what you used to like as a child. I think again that's just really healthy, because it's really important to derive pleasure from food and joy. And a lot of those foods as well might have really nice memories attached to them as well, making food a pleasure again.
Yeah, so it's like, it's kind of, it's the simple advice, but it's really hard to apply. It's like, eat a balanced diet, so don't have the forbidden foods. And I really like that advice of having five foods that you think are forbidden, and then starting with the fifth one, and then applying the structure there. And then the foods you don't have as much of an issue with, you probably could have less structure. um, just something I'm
Yeah.
thinking about, a quote unquote forbidden food, or drink. So alcohol, as in, how does that tie into disordered eating? Is there any connection there, or Is it completely separate altogether?
Yeah, and I think it can often be tied up. I mean, I think people that are generally kind of more like restrictive eaters, so more towards anorexia or just, they're probably like would be avoiding alcohol anyway because we're so worried about the calories. But I think particularly with perhaps bulimia or binge eating, often, alcohol can serve a similar function to almost kind of like escape, sort of, get off the treadmill of life a bit, soothe feelings, all those kind of things. So for some people, alcohol might be quite tied up maybe with binging, it could make binging worse, kind of like, again, like blood sugar fluctuations as well, kind of exacerbate all the symptoms really. So I guess it's quite individual. I mean, I think generally with eating disorders, it's probably for most people, the alcohol and the food are separate things. But again, there's definitely a proportion of people where alcohol is got a bit tied up in it too.
Good to know. Yeah. Okay. So then the next one, what are the most common challenges people have with food? So like a very general question. So like, I guess to make it more specific, like kind of recently over the pandemic, what are like the challenges people are having that you see with your clients?
Well, I guess like things like kind of hoarding food, I think particularly in like the earlier stages of the pandemic where we had all these sort of food shortages and things, there was no pasta on the shelves. And I think, scarcity for a human being, it really sort of triggers our primal need of feeling like we need to kind of like, yeah, hoard food, hoard things because of it. We feel really unsafe. So I think, so was it one thing you wanted or?
Yeah, that's a good one. So I kind of food scarcity, I guess. Would that be the topic there you're going into?
Yeah. No, and I guess that's a kind of a problem just anyway. Anyone that tends to restrict will tend to kind of hoard food, and not even realize they're doing it. And it's really interesting behavior actually, because they don't just hoard food, they'll often hoard other kind of things like, like I don't know, like loo roll or like plastic bags or kind of like other things that you might use around the home. But yeah, there's definitely something about if if you've got disordered eating that you want to kind of feel safe, you want to feel a sense of control, and hoarding food can become part of that. And definitely saw that more in the pandemic.
Yeah, you can imagine it as well because of the grocery stores not having the full stock. So it's like, society is telling you, oh, you need to stock up. But I guess then if it lasts longer than when stock supplies are low, that's when you really need to reflect and see, do you need extra help?
Yeah.
Just the last one then. So what are your three best tips to improve our relationship with food? So we think, okay, I'm not really happy with my relationship with food. I kind of have some black and white foods or forbidden foods. You've given a lot already. Is there any more tips you could think of?
Sure. I mean, I suppose the tips I haven't sort of mentioned. I mean, I think one thing as well is like becoming much more aware of your thoughts. We have 60,000 thoughts a day. A lot of those thoughts are repetitive. If you're having a lot of thoughts like, I mustn't eat that because it's going to make me become really overweight, or things like, I'm a greedy pig if I'm eating that food. A lot of those thoughts can be really unhelpful, really destructive, and then it can actually make eating disorder behaviors worse. So again, it's like beginning to like step back, have a bit more awareness and sort of think about your sort of thinking a bit more. Um, and yeah, and then I kind of want to repeat some of the earlier things really, because I think like the regular eating, stabilizing blood sugar, I think that's almost like one of my top tips really. And then the emotional eating as well. So starting to tune in much more and like starting to like pause and reflect and get more in tune with your emotions. I think just really, really important because of when you're very dissociated from your body, when you're very dissociated from how you feel, it's quite hard to have a healthy relationship with food because of you're not really tuning in to your kind of hunger, your fullness, what you're really needing, and you're often then using food as the shortcut to soothe, to comfort, to control. When actually there could be lots of other things that you could be doing instead, which are actually more going to meet your needs and more correctly, I guess, more helpfully, rather than like turning to food as the kind of first thing. And I guess just to say with that as well, it's not that all emotional eating is wrong. As human beings, we don't just eat for function. Emotional eating is part of life, but you don't want it to be your like one strategy that you always rely on to soothe your emotions. You want to feel like you've got about 10 different strategies, and food is one of them.
Yeah, have multiple coping strategies. Yeah. I just remember a quote from the psychologist Jordan Peterson. So he said, For depression, or I think anxiety as well, it's like, consider eating a meal because your blood sugar actually might be low. So I know that's like a different condition altogether, but you'd be surprised how if you have that kind of binge strict approach, or even fasting, you might actually just need a meal and you're just depriving yourself. But I'm going outside of my scope of practice here. That's definitely, something that you would be advising people on.
Yeah, well, it's interesting, isn't it? I think it's so much like the fundamentals, isn't it? Of like, we often overlook just things like getting enough sleep, staying hydrated, making sure we're eating regularly, and just those kind of like building blocks of self-care can have huge benefits for your mental health. And we just often forget that, really. And I know it's all very well to say it here because it sounds so simple, but when you get in a really low place, sometimes it can be really hard to implement those things. But I always think as well, just baby steps, isn't it? Because it's the classic thing of we overestimate what we can achieve in the next couple of months, and we massively underestimate what we can achieve when we think long term. So I'm always saying to people as well, like, just embrace the baby steps, really go for underwhelming steps, really, because then it's sustainable, and you're going to get momentum, and you're actually going to produce some change over time that's all going to add up.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember a story I heard about a writer who was writing for a fitness magazine, and his January, the kind of the peak time in the fitness calendar, his January article was, this year, instead of trying to lose all the weight in 1 month, why not try and just weigh 1 pound less than you do now? So like, in 12 months, just lose a pound, just very sustainable. And because that wasn't, sexy enough, or wasn't sensational enough, it didn't get to print, like it didn't get to magazine. But it's like, how often do people yo-yo diet versus how often do people lose 1 pound, a year, or just make those baby steps? And you kind of have to get excited about the boring stuff almost, because the boring stuff works really.
Yeah, no, it's true, isn't it? It's all those little things, isn't it? And I think we all had that kind of fantasy sometimes about this one thing that's going to change our life overnight, but it's not really what works, is it? It is
Yeah.
all the little things that add up.
Yeah. And you wouldn't appreciate it if it happened overnight. You wouldn't have put the work in, or you wouldn't have had the highs and lows and stuff. So yeah, you definitely want sustainable and lasting change to take time, even though it's not what society tells us sometimes. So Harry, that's it. Thank you very, very much for your time and your insights. It was amazing. Do you have kind of any like services or anything upcoming you want to tell people about, or any projects you're working on?
Sure. Well, I guess I just say, like, do follow me on Instagram. I'm at the eating disorder therapist, underscores between the words. And then the eating disorder therapist podcast as well. Do come and listen to the eating disorder therapist podcast. And I've got a book club as a sort of an offshoot from that as well at the moment. So we read like a book a month. And so you get like, you like pay like £5, like $7 a month, and then you get like 4 additional podcast episodes, and then we kind of read a book. So it's like an opportunity for like extra support and encouragement on your healing journey.
Brilliant. That's a great idea. And I'll be sure to check out the podcast. Didn't actually know you had one, but I've seen your content on Instagram, which is really good. So thanks very much, Harriet, for your time. And maybe we will be on again soon for part 2.
Yeah, no, lovely. Okay, thanks for having me, Ross.